I heard the front door click, and my heart skipped. Even though it was just the usual sound of the latch, something about it felt off tonight. There was this stifling tension in the air, like the room was trying to tell me a secret before she stepped inside. I was in the kitchen, staring at the clock above the sink. My eyes flicked back and forth between the second hand and the door, nerves buzzing in my chest. When Amanda finally walked in, I sensed a jolt of energy pass through the house. It was subtle, but real enough to make my palms sweat. She gave me a quick glance, fleeting, uneasy, and shot me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Normally, she'd greet me with a cheerful hello, but today she just exhaled. There was no warmth behind it, like she was forcing the moment to pass as quickly as possible. She moved deeper into the hallway, letting the door swing closed behind her with a hollow thud. I tried to shake off the creeping sense that something was different. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe she was just tired. But the more I looked at her, the more my pulse seemed to race. Everything about her felt guarded. She was gripping her purse strap, knuckles almost white, and there was a strange tension in her shoulders. Usually, after coming back from work, she'd be relaxed once she stepped through the door, happy to be home. But now, her posture felt like she was preparing for an interrogation. "Hey," I managed to say, forcing a casual tone I didn't feel. "How was everything?" I caught myself before finishing that sentence because I realized I didn't even know what I was asking. The real question that was burning a hole in my mind was why she looked so on edge. Why did my own wife suddenly feel like a stranger standing in our living room? She cleared her throat as if hunting for the right words. "Everything's fine," she mumbled. Her voice was weirdly high, the kind of pitch you get when you're not telling the whole truth. She threw her shoes off in the corner, her movements stiff and hurried, then set her purse on the small table by the door. I watched her carefully. Every little detail felt magnified, like I was viewing the moment through a lens that highlighted every tension in her face, every tremor in her voice. My stomach tightened with a rush of anxiety. I thought maybe I should just come right out and ask if something was wrong, but I hesitated. Confrontation wasn't exactly my favorite pastime, and I kept convincing myself that maybe I was overreacting. I told myself to wait, to see if she'd calm down or share something. She walked toward the couch, ran her fingers through her hair, and her eyes flickered away from me. I noticed her breath quickening, her chest rising and falling faster than usual. Then she forced another awkward smile. It almost made me more uncomfortable than if she'd glared at me. For a split second, I wondered if she'd had some argument with someone at the office, or if she'd gotten bad news. Maybe there was an explanation that would make me feel foolish for suspecting her of anything sinister. But beneath that veneer of forced calm, she was practically radiating an unspoken tension. I tried to lighten the mood. "I made something for dinner," I said, pointing to the stove behind me. "I figured we could eat together." Normally, this would have earned me a grateful smile or a playful comment about how it was her turn to cook. Instead, she just nodded, her mouth curving slightly at the corners, but never quite becoming a real smile. That's when it dawned on me that she was trying to act normal. She was fidgeting with her hair, tracing circles on the couch's armrest, and blinking more than usual. My heart thudded in my chest as I tried to unravel her sudden change in demeanor. I couldn't pinpoint a single reason for her to be acting like this unless. But I refused to let my mind go there. I knew that if I admitted my darkest fears, things would never be the same again. We stood there in the living room, the clock on the wall ticking loudly in the background. I couldn't take the silence anymore. "Amanda," I started, my voice wobbling with unspoken questions. "Are you?" Before I could form the rest of the sentence, she turned away from me and walked toward the hallway, mumbling that she needed to get more comfortable. She threw on a pair of loose sweatpants she had neatly folded atop the laundry basket by the door. I remember staring at her legs and noticing this distinct, unsettling detail, the outline beneath her skirt a moment ago. The instant she moved, I realized she wasn't wearing any underwear. My heart hammered in my chest. In that one moment, The image carved itself into my mind like a neon sign screaming for my attention. There was no reason, absolutely none, for her to come home from work like that. My face flushed, and I felt a strange mix of disbelief and dread. Every assumption I'd made about our evening shattered, replaced by questions that had no gentle answers. She grabbed her phone, a trembling hand clutched around its case, and looked up at me with eyes that I couldn't decipher. I stood there, stunned, every nerve in my body on high alert. The tension in the room was suffocating, made worse by the fact that I couldn't think of a single explanation that didn't tear at my trust in her. I told myself I needed to get to the bottom of this, that there had to be a rational excuse. But the voice in my head kept whispering that I already knew what it meant, that this wasn't a trivial oversight but a clue screaming louder than words ever could. As the silence stretched, she forced a tight smile and opened her mouth like she was about to say something, but no words came out. In that suspended moment, I realized there was no going back to how it was before. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the truth was standing right in front of me, glaring in its obviousness. Something had changed, and my marriage would never be the same. I swallowed hard, my mind already spinning, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do next. Her eyes flicked away from mine one more time. That was when I knew for sure. My life was on the brink of a revelation I never asked for and couldn't prevent. And just like that, I understood there was no easy way out of this unfolding nightmare. It was just after sunrise when I finally let myself exhale. My mind had been racing all night, cycling through every detail of Amanda's strange behavior the evening before. I lay awake replaying the moment she came home, the way her eyes darted around as if she were hiding something. And that shocking detail I couldn't ignore, no underwear when she changed into her sweatpants. The realization had lit a spark of dread inside me that refused to burn out, even as darkness gave way to dawn. The next few days, I tried to act as though nothing had changed. But beneath my forced calm, the worry gnawed at me. Every time Amanda looked at her phone, every time she disappeared into another room, my mind reeled with possibilities. Paranoia was a new feeling for me, and it settled into my bones like a bitter chill that wouldn't let go. I told myself I needed proof, something tangible to confirm that I wasn't losing it. Because if there was even a chance I'd misunderstood or jumped to the worst conclusion, I didn't want to burn our marriage to the ground over a misguided hunch. But she made it almost impossible not to suspect something. Each afternoon, she seemed more distant. We'd sit across from each other at the table, and I'd watch her press her lips together like she was trying to keep some secret from spilling out. My attempts at conversation felt like talking to a statue. She answered in short, clipped phrases, avoiding eye contact. I'd look at her phone perched on the table, see the screen light up with a message she quickly hid, and my heart would pound so hard I was sure she could hear it. 3 nights after that first suspicion, I decided I couldn't just wait around for the truth to drop into my lap. I needed to know what was going on. Around 11, after she'd slipped off to the bedroom, I noticed she'd left her phone on the couch. That never happened. She was usually attached to that thing as if it were her lifeline. My chest tightened at the thought of going through her messages, an invasion of privacy I never imagined doing. But suspicion was tearing me apart, and I couldn't breathe without answers. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling so violently that I nearly dropped it on the carpet. Every scenario flashed through my mind. What if I found nothing? What if I found everything? I considered the risk. If I was wrong, I'd destroy her trust for no reason. If I was right, well, there might not be any trust left to save. Steeling myself, I pressed the screen awake. My reflection stared back at me, hollow-eyed and haunted. Before I entered the passcode, I'd seen her type out 1,000 times. My pulse thundered in my ears, so loud I thought it might wake her in the next room. The phone unlocked. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. There was a string of messages from a contact I didn't recognize. The most recent one read, "You coming tomorrow?" followed by a heart emoji. My breath caught in my throat. I swiped up to view the entire thread. It was a mixture of short, playful lines and random timing, telling me enough to know these weren't casual chats with a colleague. They felt too intimate, too personal. And I couldn't escape the proof spelled out across the screen. Amanda was meeting this person. She was planning something with them, something she couldn't tell me. I felt a jolt of nausea as I scrolled, my heart racing with every word. Words like miss and soon cut into me with startling clarity. Even in the most casual lines, there was an electric undercurrent, the sort you never want to see between your wife and a stranger. I wanted to look away, to slam the phone down and pretend I hadn't read a thing. But I forced myself to keep scrolling. I had to know how far this had gone. A message from a few days earlier mentioned an upcoming date at some place in town, a detail I hadn't heard from Amanda, not once. The person teased her about being late. She replied with a laughing comment about how she could never say no to them. My vision blurred. I had to close my eyes for a moment to stop the world from spinning. She could never say no to them? This from the same woman who once told me I was the only man she'd ever truly trusted? I clicked off the screen, heart hammering. This was real. All the half-spoken suspicions in my head had just been replaced by undeniable fact. My wife was hiding something. A meeting, a date, possibly more. An icy sweat broke over me as I stood there, holding her phone, staring at the black screen. My mind buzzed with questions. Who was this person? How long had this been going on? Had I missed obvious signs while living comfortably in my blissful ignorance? I took a shaky breath and set the phone back on the cushion, right where she'd left it. My hands felt clammy, and each heartbeat sounded like a distant explosion in my ears. I looked down the hallway, half expecting Amanda to appear and catch me in the act. But the hallway was dark and silent, like a tunnel leading to a future I suddenly didn't recognize. That night, I barely slept. Each time I closed my eyes, images of those messages flooded my thoughts. I found myself wondering how to confront her, or even if I should. A part of me wanted to pretend none of this was happening, to just shove it under the rug and hope it went away. But I knew that wasn't an option. The cracks in our relationship had become craters, and ignoring them wouldn't make them shrink. The next morning, Amanda was already up before me. I walked into the kitchen to find her sipping coffee, staring blankly out the window. She barely reacted when I said good morning, just gave me a quick glance and a nod. That hurt more than any angry confrontation could have. At least anger or frustration would be real emotions. This distant politeness felt like she was building a wall, one I wasn't sure I could climb. My mind started fishing for more clues. Did she leave the house earlier than usual? Did she come back later? Were her excuses holding up under scrutiny? Every small deviation from our regular routine felt magnified, like I had a giant lens pointed at her life. She glanced at her phone a couple of times, then slipped it into her pocket as if she were worried I might read her screen. I pretended not to notice, going through the motions of making my breakfast, but inside, I was screaming with questions. Later that day, I decided to search for something more solid. I figured if she was meeting someone in secret, maybe there'd be a clue somewhere obvious. I walked into the garage and peeked inside her car. I could practically feel my heart beating in my throat, the echo of doubt telling me I was crossing a line. But desperation clouded my better judgment. At first, I didn't see anything out of place. Just the same old scattered items. A phone charger, a water bottle, some crumpled tissues in the console. But as I crouched to look under the passenger seat, I spotted a small notebook I'd never seen before. The second I touched it, I felt that same jolt of dread I'd experienced when I discovered her messages. I flipped it open to a marked page, and there, scribbled across it, were fragments of lines, times of day, cryptic words hinting at secret meetups. A date next to a check mark. My mind raced as I pieced together her new routine. There were specific notes about which days worked best, and short references to areas around town I rarely frequented, places she never told me about. The realization hit me with a sickening clarity. She was scheduling her meetings with precise care, making sure I'd never find out. She'd become an expert in deception while I was busy trusting her. I closed the notebook, my breath shaky. The pages told me everything I needed to know. Amanda was living two lives, one with me and one with someone else. The cold reality made my hands tremble, my heart pounding as I stood there in our own garage, feeling like a trespasser in a life I thought was mine. I walked back into the house with the notebook pressed to my side, desperate to hide it from view. I wanted to confront her right then, slam it down on the table and demand answers. But my fear of what she'd say, of how she'd twist the narrative, stopped me. It felt like stepping off a cliff into an endless drop. The only thing that kept me from going over the edge was the single thought that maybe I still didn't know the entire truth. That night, after Amanda went to bed, I stood alone in the living room, staring at our wedding photo on the mantel. We looked so happy. Now, every day, every hour, I felt that happiness slipping through my fingers like sand. I wanted to scream at the version of me in that photo, warn him about what was to come. I heard a faint chime from the bedroom. Her phone again, no doubt. And in that silence, a wave of resolution washed over me. Whatever was happening, I couldn't keep living in this state of suspicion and fear. I had to act, to rip away the mask and see what lay beneath, even if it destroyed everything I knew. But as I walked toward our bedroom to confront her, I heard Amanda's muffled voice behind the closed door. She was on a call. A name slipped from her lips, someone I'd never heard her mention before. I leaned in, heart in my throat, trying to catch every word. Suddenly, she stopped mid-sentence, as if she sensed my presence. The door swung open, and there she stood, phone clutched to her ear, shock written all over her face. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity. Then she ended the call without a word. I swallowed hard, bracing myself for whatever was about to come next. Because in that moment, I could tell she knew I was onto her, and I had a terrifying feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than either of us could control. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my thoughts dragged me back to that moment at our bedroom door. Amanda ending her phone call the second she saw me, guilt written all over her face. It felt like standing at the edge of an unfinished puzzle, the missing pieces scattered around me in plain sight. The knowledge that she was lying, that she'd been lying for who knows how long, settled on my chest like a weight I couldn't escape. I spent the early hours of the morning pacing between the living room and the kitchen. My pulse roared in my ears, echoing the questions banging against the inside of my skull. Why her? Why us? When did it start? And most crushingly, why didn't I see it sooner? By the time the first hints of daylight crept through the blinds, I couldn't stand another minute of silence. The confrontation I'd been dreading was inevitable. The only thing left was to let the truth spill out, no matter how deep it cut. Amanda came into the kitchen looking even more tense than the day before. She paused at the threshold, spotting me by the table, arms folded tight against my chest. I imagine I must have looked like a statue carved out of anger and heartbreak. She offered a stiff greeting, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't wait for small talk. "We need to talk," I said, my voice coming out harsher than I'd intended. A part of me wanted to start gently, to coax the truth from her without a fight. But another part, the one stung by betrayal, refused to tiptoe around it. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. When she found none, she took a step forward, every movement dripping with caution. "Jerry, what's going on?" The question sparked something inside me. I could have laughed at the absurdity. She wanted me to spell out what was going on. I clasped my hands together, knuckles whitened by the force of my grip. "You tell me," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where have you been disappearing to? Who were you just talking to last night?" She bristled, blinking rapidly as though searching for the right response. I don't know what you're talking about," she mumbled, eyes flicking away from mine. Her cheeks reddened, but there was no genuine conviction in her denial. It felt as if she were reading lines from a script she'd barely rehearsed. I pulled out my phone, opening it to a picture I'd snapped of the messages on her device, evidence that I'd been steeling myself to reveal. I'd told myself I wouldn't go behind her back like this, but suspicion had a way of corroding all sense of decency. "So you don't know anything about these then?" My voice wavered between anger and heartbreak as I held the screen up for her to see. Her eyes widened, a surge of panic hitting her all at once. She glanced at the words displayed, and I could see the excuses forming on her lips. It's not what you think," she whispered, voice trembling. She took a step back, like she was trying to physically distance herself from the truth she'd just been confronted with. "So explain it to me," I insisted, pressing forward. "Explain why your messages say you've been meeting someone. Explain why you came home with no underwear the other night. Explain that notebook I found in your car." The mention of her notebook made her jaw tighten. She realized how cornered she was, and for an instant, I saw defiance flicker in her eyes. "You went through my stuff," she spat, as if offended I'd trespassed on her privacy. But the next moment, her anger died away, replaced by a trembling fear. She must have recognized there was no way to spin it. I had too much proof, and she'd run out of quick lies. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her shoulders slumped in defeat. "Jerry, please," she said, her voice cracking. "It just happened. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Her words tumbled out in a rush, half-formed sentences that revealed her desperation. She started gesturing, hands trembling so badly she could barely keep them still. "I was lonely," she tried, her eyes darting away from me again. "It's not like lonely," I interrupted, my anger finally boiling over. "You have me. We live in the same house. We share the same bed. If you were lonely, why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you say something, anything, instead of sneaking around with some stranger?" My voice echoed off the walls, too loud, too raw. I hated the way I sounded, like a wounded animal, cornered and hurting. She pressed her lips together, tears streaming down her face now. It was painful to see her like that, but at the same time, my heart felt locked in a vice. I couldn't just let sympathy for her tears erase the betrayal etched into my mind. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know," she sobbed. "I can't explain it. I didn't plan it. It's my fault, everything. I know you won't believe me, but I never wanted to hurt you. Things got complicated." My chest tightened as an angry retort rose to my lips. I wanted to scream that complicated didn't cover the depth of this kind of betrayal. That she'd shattered our marriage vows, the trust we'd built for years. Instead, I let out a humorless laugh. "Complicated," I repeated, my voice dripping with bitterness. "That's what you call lying to my face day after day?" Amanda lifted her gaze, cheeks stained with tears, eyes desperate. "Please, Jerry. Just give me a chance to explain. It's not just some fling. I'm not proud of it, but I felt lost. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." She sounded like she was choking on her own words, but it was hard to tell if she was genuinely remorseful or just horrified at being caught. I stood there, adrenaline still pulsing through me. Memories of all the small, loving moments we shared flickered in my mind. Holidays, lazy weekends, inside jokes that only the two of us understood. It was as if I was watching a highlight reel of our entire relationship unravel in front of me. My chest ached in a way I'd never experienced before, and it struck me that this was the weight of heartbreak, the tangible proof that everything had changed forever. "Who is it?" I demanded, my voice raw. "Tell me." She swallowed hard, looking like she wanted to shrink into the chair. "It's someone from outside work. Just a person I met through an acquaintance." She paused, then shook her head, realizing she had no defense that could possibly satisfy me. "We started talking, and then it got out of hand." Her words were heartbreakingly vague, but they were enough to make my blood run cold. She was confirming that she'd crossed the line, not just in passing, but repeatedly, systematically. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. "You betrayed me," I said quietly, the bitterness in my tone cutting deeper than if I'd yelled. Amanda reached out, her hand shaking, as if to touch my arm, but I recoiled. The spark of guilt in her eyes told me she could sense how final this moment felt. Everything had led to this. The phone messages, the notebook, the secrets, the lies. I wanted to think that maybe there was a way to salvage our marriage, but the pain pumping through my chest told me otherwise. The entire foundation of our relationship had been yanked out from under me. "I don't even know how to fix this," she whispered, voice trembling. "But I love you, Jerry, I swear. I never wanted it to get this far. It just—" I know it sounds weak, but it spiraled before I realized what I was doing. I stared at her, my mind numb. A few minutes ago, I'd been prepared for denials, for her attempts to sweet-talk me into believing some cover story. But now that I had the truth, it felt sharper than I'd imagined. With each of her words, my heart bled a little more. A suffocating silence fell over the kitchen. The air was thick with the weight of everything that had just been confessed. It was like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final blow to land. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the background, mocking the emptiness between us. Amanda opened her mouth to say something else, but I turned away, refusing to see the desperation etched on her face. "I'm done," I said, my voice hollow. "I can't even look at you right now." My anger had burned so hot and fast that all I was left with was a cold, clenching ache. Without another word, I marched down the hallway to our bedroom. Every step was weighted with the realization that I might not be coming back. The photos lining the walls, the pictures from vacations, birthdays, wedding celebrations, seemed to taunt me, reminding me of the life we'd built and how easily it was crumbling. I grabbed a bag from the closet, my hands moving almost on autopilot. The adrenaline made my fingers clumsy, but I forced myself to be methodical, tossing in clothes, essentials, not caring if I left anything behind. How absurd, I thought, that I was packing my life away in a matter of minutes. Yet the alternative, staying in that house, pretending we could fix this overnight, felt impossible. Amanda stood at the bedroom door, tears streaming down her cheeks, looking powerless to stop me. She reached out toward me, but I sidestepped her attempt at contact, stuffing another shirt into the bag before zipping it shut. My hand brushed against the ring on my finger, a painful reminder of the vows we'd exchanged. For a moment, I stared at the simple band, memories flooding back, the day we said, "I do," the way I'd felt invincible standing next to her, the promises we made to keep each other safe and loved. Now it all felt like a cruel joke. Her voice cracked behind me, so low I almost couldn't hear her. "Please don't leave," she whispered. "We can talk about this. We can try." I turned around, my eyes burning with tears I refused to let fall. "There's nothing left to say," I muttered. My own words surprised me with how final they sounded, but I knew there was no other choice. "Not right now." She didn't argue. She just looked at me with an expression that hovered between heartbreak and guilt. I could see she wanted to beg, to cling to any shred of hope, but knew better than to push further. The truth was out, and neither of us could put it back. Bag slung over my shoulder, I brushed past her and into the hallway, refusing to let myself look back. My whole body trembled with anger, betrayal, and an emptiness that threatened to swallow me whole. The last thing I saw before I turned the corner was her hunched form, arms wrapped around herself, tears still streaming down her face. I reached the front door and flung it open, stepping outside into the crisp air. In the distance, the sun was creeping over the horizon, casting a pale, almost mocking light on the scene. Part of me wondered where I would go, but that question paled compared to the crushing realization that my marriage, my life, was on the brink of collapse. I heard her soft sob echo through the hall behind me, a shattered sound that would have once brought me running to comfort her. But now, it only fueled the sorrow and anger warring inside me. Without a second glance, I walked out, letting the door swing shut behind me. And that was it. I left her standing alone in a house that felt more like a memory than a home. My heart pounded with the finality of it all, a beat so loud I couldn't think of anything else. Part of me hoped she'd follow, say something that could erase the pain of what I'd just discovered. But she didn't. And some distant logical part of my mind accepted that there was no magic phrase to fix this kind of betrayal. In that moment, it sunk in. Everything was different now. And I had no idea what kind of life was waiting for me outside that door. Only that it couldn't possibly be worse than staying in a place built on lies. Lightning streaked across the dim sky as I turned the car engine off, realizing I had nowhere else to go. The parking lot I'd pulled into was empty except for a flickering lamppost and a single stray cat skulking around for scraps. My heart hammered in my chest, and my arms felt heavy, like I'd been carrying an impossible weight all day. In a sense, I had. I leaned back against the headrest, the car's interior suddenly too cramped, and tried to make sense of the gaping hole that had opened up in my life. For so long, Amanda and I had been a solid unit. At least that's what I believed. But in a matter of days, that sense of security had unraveled, leaving me stunned and adrift. My head pounded with thoughts I couldn't corral. The confrontation in our kitchen, the sight of her tear-streaked face, the note of finality in my own voice as I told her I was done. It felt unreal. Yet here I was, alone, surrounded by the cold glow of a desolate parking lot, struggling to remember the person I was before I met her. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting each inhalation like it might stave off the tide of emotions swelling inside my chest. Anger flared first, hot and insistent, reminding me of her betrayal. How she'd looked at me with pleading eyes and begged me not to leave, when all the while she'd been sneaking around behind my back. The memory sent a jolt of fury through my veins, and my fists clenched around the steering wheel. Then, just as quickly, sadness washed over me, a deep ache in the pit of my stomach I couldn't ignore. The realization that my marriage, something I'd believed would last a lifetime, was over. That knowledge cut deeper than any anger could. I squeezed my eyes shut, letting out a breath that sounded more like a choked sob than an exhale. Amanda's face flashed in my mind, the smile she used to reserve just for me, the quiet evenings we'd spend planning our future. Had all of that been nothing but a fragile illusion? Moments later, self-doubt came creeping in. I found myself asking questions that had no easy answers. Had I been a bad husband? Had I missed the signs of her unhappiness until it was too late? Was there something I could have done differently, some conversation I could have started that would have changed our fate? My mind spun in circles, searching for a single moment in time where I might have prevented this. But regret only tangled itself with confusion, leaving me no closer to peace. I stared out the windshield at the dark horizon, half expecting the sky to give me some sign I was on the right path. Instead, thunder rumbled in the distance, and I realized how futile it was to wait for any cosmic guidance. There was no map for heartbreak, no instruction manual on how to rebuild your life after discovering your spouse has betrayed you. Eventually, the tension in my chest demanded I move. I needed a place to think, somewhere that didn't feel as hollow as this parking lot. After flipping on the engine again, I drove aimlessly through dimly lit streets, the neon glow of storefront signs blurring in the corners of my vision. My thoughts were so loud they drowned out the radio, a relentless commentary on everything I'd lost. I ended up at a modest motel on the outskirts of town, drawn by the vacancy sign blinking in the window. Once inside, I checked in with a clerk who barely looked up from a small TV screen. He handed me a key and mumbled my room number without meeting my eyes. I guess heartbreak didn't show much on the outside, or maybe he was just too caught up in his own life to notice mine was in shreds. My room was small, dominated by a bed that sagged in the middle and a single chair near the window. A dull overhead light revealed peeling wallpaper and a stained carpet, but at least it was a place to rest. Dropping my bag on the chair, I sank onto the edge of the bed. The sheets smelled vaguely of detergent, a faint, oddly comforting hint of cleanliness. The quiet weighed on me. I thought back to 1,000 small moments with Amanda. Private jokes whispered under the covers, the shared laughter in the morning over breakfast, the warmth of her hand in mine. Now all of that was overshadowed by the image of her tearful confession, the notebook full of secrets, and the messages on her phone. I let out a shuddering breath, burying my face in my hands. My mind replayed the confrontation over and over, like a twisted highlight reel I couldn't pause. The memory of her denial, followed by her confession, felt like two opposing realities colliding. She'd been desperate enough to try lying first, but then the truth poured out, along with tears and words of apology that, at this point, felt too little, too late. For a while, I let the pain just wash over me. Grief, anger, betrayal, they all seared me from the inside. But as the night wore on, something else stirred beneath my despair, a small, fragile sense of possibility. If our marriage had truly ended, then I had to figure out what came next. My life was more than just Jerry and Amanda, even if I'd forgotten that for a long time. I thought about calling a friend, but shame crept up my spine, reminding me how humiliating it felt to admit that my wife had cheated on me. Still, I knew I couldn't keep this whole mess a secret forever. People would notice. My parents would ask why Amanda wasn't around. Mutual friends would want to know where we both disappeared to. Sooner or later, the truth would have to come out. But for now, I was content to be alone in the stale glow of a cheap motel lamp, letting myself grieve for the life I'd lost. No matter how strong I tried to be, there was no denying the emotional devastation. I picked at the fraying edge of the bedspread, my gaze distant, feeling more exhausted than I'd ever felt in my life. The hours passed in a haze of restless thoughts. Sometimes I raged inwardly, cursing her name for what she'd done, how she'd torn our bond to shreds. Other times, I could only focus on my own failings, wondering if her infidelity was a reflection of something missing in me. My heart twisted itself in knots as I weighed every memory of our relationship, searching for hints of the moment it all started falling apart. Eventually, I found myself wandering the motel's halls, the worn carpet muffling my footsteps. The corridor was eerie in its isolation, each door bearing a tarnished number and a few peeling stickers. It smelled faintly of musty air freshener. The hush pressed in on me, and I realized my life felt as empty as these echoing passageways. Even so, it was in that quiet moment I understood that no matter how excruciating it felt, I had to accept what had happened. Dwelling on how or why it started wouldn't change the reality that it had. At some point, I circled back to my room, shoulders sagging, a heaviness in my chest that refused to lift. But for all the pain flooding my thoughts, a sliver of determination began to emerge. I realized I still had a choice about what would come next. Maybe not about Amanda's betrayal, but about how I would handle it, how I would shape my future. That realization was like a faint lamp flickering in a dark tunnel. Small, but crucial for finding my way out. I sank onto the bed once more, letting the silence coil around me. My eyes burned, though I couldn't tell if it was from exhaustion or the lingering threat of tears. In the past, I'd never been one to shy away from challenges, and this would be the hardest one yet. Learning to trust again, if I ever could. Learning to see myself as whole without the person I'd built my life around. It was a daunting thought, and my hands started to tremble. Still, I found a tiny measure of calm in the awareness that this heartbreak, devastating though it was, didn't mean my story was over. There was a strange comfort in realizing that I had no choice but to keep going, to get up the next day, and the one after that. Even if every morning started with a memory of betrayal, it would also bring the chance for me to figure out who I was beyond my broken marriage. In the quiet of that motel room, I whispered a vow to myself. I wouldn't let this destroy me. Yes, I'd been shocked by the betrayal. Yes, I was scared, wounded, and uncertain how to move forward. But I would find a way. One day at a time, one painful step after another. As the storm finally rolled across the sky, rain battering the windows in a relentless rhythm, my chest tightened with an odd mix of grief and resolve. I didn't know if I was mourning the death of something cherished or finding the first spark of a new beginning. Maybe it was both. All I knew was that the emptiness I felt wouldn't vanish by morning. I'd have to carry it for a while, let it reshape me, and hope that someday I'd be able to look back on this night without the stab of fresh pain. Just before exhaustion claimed me, my phone buzzed in my bag. I grabbed it, half dreading whatever message might appear on the screen. Sure enough, Amanda's name lit up. A single notification. A missed call. My heart twisted, and my thumb hovered over the phone's display, uncertain whether to call her back or block her entirely. Did I really want to hear more apologies, more explanations? In the end, I placed the phone face down on the nightstand, ignoring her silent plea to reconnect. The ache in my chest was too raw, and I wasn't ready to let her voice crack it open again. But as I sat there, eyes locked on the shadows dancing across the ceiling, an uneasy thought surfaced. Walking away might have been the first step to healing, but it wasn't the end. The real struggle was just beginning, and I wasn't sure what shape it would take or how long it would last. Despite my exhaustion, my mind wouldn't let me rest. A quiet dread sank in as I accepted that the heartbreak, the anger, the self-doubt, none of it would be easy to silence. The scars of betrayal don't vanish overnight. They linger in each corner of your thoughts, reminding you of what you lost and what you might still gain. I realized, with a slow heaviness settling over me, that tomorrow could be even harder than today. And that realization, intimidating, yet somehow fueled by the faintest glimmer of hope, was enough to keep me awake, staring into the darkness, bracing for whatever came next. A streak of sunlight crept through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the motel room's shabby wallpaper. Even though the bed was stiff and I'd barely slept, something inside me had shifted when dawn arrived. The heaviness in my chest was still there. Heartbreak doesn't vanish overnight, but alongside it, I felt the faint stirrings of resolve. It was time to move forward, however painful that might be. I rolled out of bed, shoved my belongings back into my duffel bag, and stepped out into the crisp morning air, unsure but determined to take back control of my life. The first thing I did was drive straight to the law office of an old acquaintance named Mark Russell. We'd gone to high school together, though we'd fallen out of touch for years. After everything that had happened, I wanted someone I could trust to guide me through the divorce process. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than I should have, still battling a whirlwind of memories. Amanda's confession, the messages, the confrontation. But I forced myself to breathe, focusing on the road ahead. Mark's office was housed in a modest brick building surrounded by sycamore trees. The sign read Russell and Dawkins, Family Law. I took a shaky breath and walked inside, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with paper and printer toner. A friendly receptionist directed me to a small, glass-walled conference room. After a few minutes, Mark appeared, looking sharper and more confident than I remembered from our teenage years. He wore a tailored suit, but his warm smile and easy demeanor were unchanged. "Jerry," he said, offering me a firm handshake. "Long time no see. Wish it were under better circumstances." I tried for a wry grin but managed only a grimace. "Yeah, well, life doesn't always cooperate." He gestured for me to sit at the long wooden table. "How about we talk everything through, see what we can do?" I settled into a chair, my heart pounding more than it should. This felt like the first domino in a chain reaction I couldn't stop. "Sure. I hesitated, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I need a divorce, Mark. I can't stay married to her." His expression softened. "I'm sorry. I know this has to be hard. Just talk me through what happened, and we'll figure out a plan. I'll guide you through the necessary steps, from filing the papers to protecting your assets. You're not alone in this." I nodded, feeling both relieved and uneasy. It hurt to say the words out loud, to confirm that my marriage was ending. But it also felt like a grim sort of liberation, a line drawn between what was and what would be. I took a breath, then laid out the basics. Her infidelity, how I'd discovered it, the confrontation, my decision to leave. Mark listened intently, scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he looked up, an empathetic crease on his forehead. "Given the situation, it shouldn't be too complicated," he said gently, "but it will still be emotional. I'll draft a petition, and we'll serve her as soon as possible. You'll need to come back in to finalize details about property and any joint accounts." I nodded and tried to ignore the way my gut twisted at the thought of making everything official. Still, this was the path I'd chosen, and I would see it through. "Thanks," I managed. "I appreciate it." He placed a hand on my shoulder as I rose to leave. "Take care of yourself, Jerry. This is just the start of a new chapter. Painful, yeah, but you'll get through it." I swallowed hard, meeting his eyes. For once, I believed those words might be true. Later that day, I returned to the house Amanda and I once shared. She wasn't home. Her car was gone. I still had my key, and I let myself inside. The place felt strange, like it had lost its identity overnight. The walls, pictures, and furniture were exactly as we'd left them, but the warmth I once associated with these rooms was gone. I walked through the living room, noticing how the silence pressed in around me. When I first left, I'd acted on raw emotion. Now I was here with purpose, to reclaim what was mine, to set the stage for the next phase of my life. If Amanda and I were truly over, I wasn't about to keep living in a space that reminded me of her every second. I went to the bedroom, took down the framed wedding photos, and set them aside. The ache of doing that was almost unbearable, but I knew I couldn't move forward if I kept them on display. I opened the windows, letting fresh air sweep away the lingering sense of betrayal. After a moment's hesitation, I grabbed a cardboard box and filled it with anything that reminded me too strongly of her. Shared vacation souvenirs, trinkets we bought together at antique shops, random little tokens of our life as a couple. Each item I dropped in the box felt like a small heartbreak, but also a step toward something new. Once the painful part was done, I found myself pacing around, searching for ways to make the place feel more like mine. The old guitar I used to play in college collected dust in the closet. I hauled it out, cleaning and tuning it until the strings chimed with a clear, crisp note that brought back memories of a younger, more carefree me. I propped the guitar in the living room corner, making it a small statement. I was allowed to embrace who I used to be before I got lost in a marriage that had now dissolved. Sometime in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, expecting more messages from Amanda, but the name on the screen stopped me. Corey. He was a close friend from my college days, someone I'd drifted apart from over the years. With a flicker of optimism, I answered. "Jerry, hey," he said, voice brimming with the warmth of old camaraderie. "I heard a rumor you might be back in town for a bit. Everything okay?" I let out a sigh, bitterness laced with weary acceptance. "Not exactly. I'm going through some stuff. Trying to get my life back on track." There was a long pause. "You want to grab coffee or something? Talk it out." I glanced at the scattered boxes and the bare wall where our wedding photo once hung. It was tempting to keep isolating myself, but I realized how important it was not to drown in my own thoughts. "Sure," I replied, clearing my throat. "Coffee sounds good." Within an hour, I was sitting across from Corey at a corner booth in a cozy cafe. The aroma of freshly ground beans wafted around us, and for the first time in days, I felt a faint sense of comfort. Corey took a sip of his latte and gave me a knowing look. "So, spill it. What's going on?" I fiddled with the cardboard sleeve around my cup, searching for the right words. "I'm, filing for divorce," I finally said. The weight of those words didn't sting quite as much as it had earlier, but it was still raw. "Amanda, she cheated on me. I found out. I confronted her, and now I can't do this anymore." Corey shook his head, sympathy knitting his brows together. "Man, I'm so sorry. That's rough. How are you holding up?" I wanted to lie, to say I was fine, but I realized it was pointless. "I'm a mess. Angry. Hurt. Sometimes I question everything about myself. But I'm trying to focus on the future, you know? I'm doing what I have to do." He nodded. "Well, if you need anything, a place to crash, someone to talk to, I'm here. You know that, right?" I mustered a small smile. "Thanks, man. It means more than you know." We sipped our coffees in a comfortable silence for a moment. The cafe buzzed with quiet conversation and the hiss of espresso machines. a far cry from the emotional tension that had dominated my life lately. Corey nudged me. Hey, remember how you used to come out for hikes on the weekends? We've got some killer trails near town now. Maybe we can hit one up, clear your head. The thought of doing something physical, reconnecting with nature, sparked a tiny flame of excitement. I'd like that, I admitted. I need to do something normal again. Over the next few days, I took small steps back into the world of living. I started texting other friends, explaining in vague terms that Amanda and I were splitting up, then met them for lunch or coffee when I could. Surprisingly, most of them rallied around me with comforting words and open arms. I was shocked at how supportive people could be once I let them in on my problems. I also threw myself into old hobbies I'd let slip away. Mornings became a time for music, strumming my guitar, picking out tunes I hadn't tried since my 20s. Sometimes the sound filled the empty house with a melancholic echo, but it was still better than silence. Afternoons, I'd rearrange furniture or work on minor home repairs I'd been putting off. Even painting a single accent wall in a bold color felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd forgotten about. One late afternoon, I was in the kitchen, trying out a recipe I'd bookmarked months ago, when my phone buzzed. It was Mark, my lawyer friend. "Hey," he said brightly when I answered. "I just wanted you to know the papers are filed. We're making progress." I paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. "Thanks," I said quietly. "I guess it's official now." Mark's voice softened. "Look, I know this is tough. It'll take time, but you're doing the right thing if that's what your gut tells you. I've seen people try to hold on, only to tear themselves apart." I glanced around my kitchen, newly organized and stripped of Amanda's personal touches. Strange how a room could feel both foreign and more like mine at the same time. "Yeah," I replied. "I just want to move on, you know? I don't want to be bitter forever." Mark cleared his throat. "Well, I have faith in you. Let me know if you need anything else." I thanked him and ended the call. For a moment, I just stood there, absorbing the realization that my divorce was moving forward. A swirl of emotions rose in me. Sadness, yes, but also a newfound determination. This was happening, and for the first time, it felt like more than just a painful ending. It felt like a chance to rebuild. That evening, Corey swung by the house. He whistled at the rearranged living room, noticing the lack of our old wedding photos. "Wow," he said, "you're really making changes." I shrugged, a faint smile on my lips. It's not the same place anymore, so I figured it shouldn't look the same. He nodded. "Good call. You gonna be okay here?" I sighed, looking around. Despite the memories we'd made within these walls, the space felt like a blank canvas now. "I think I will be," I said. "Eventually." His gaze drifted to the corner where my guitar rested. "Glad to see you're picking that up again. You were pretty good back in college." A flicker of pride warmed me. "Thanks. It's been a while, but it helps me think, you know? Gives me something to focus on." Corey gave me a supportive pat on the back. "Well, if you ever feel like putting on a show, give me a heads up." I laughed. An actual laugh that felt genuine and light. "I'll let you know." After he left, I walked around the house, noticing how each room felt a little less haunted by Amanda's presence. True, the heartbreak still existed, and I'd have to grapple with it for a long time. But something new had started growing in that void, an appreciation for my own needs, my own choices. I sank onto the couch, letting out a slow breath. The divorce would be a turbulent road. I knew that. And the scars of betrayal wouldn't fade easily. But for the first time in weeks, I sensed a spark of genuine optimism. I had friends who cared, a home I could mold to fit my new life, and a renewed passion for the things I once loved. Sure, I was nervous about the future. There would be moments of backsliding, days when I'd think about her, wonder if we could have salvaged something. But overall, I felt stronger, like I was rediscovering the parts of myself that I'd set aside in the name of marriage and routine. I still ached for what had been lost, but in that ache, I began to see an open door instead of a locked cell. I picked up the guitar, fingers testing the strings with a soft chord. The notes filled the living room with a subdued melody, echoing a sense of cautious hope. A gentle wave of relief coursed through me. This was my life now, raw, painful, but undeniably real. And in that reality, there was room to grow, to learn, to rediscover who I was before betrayal turned my world upside down. As the melody continued, I let my eyes drift closed. The finality of filing for divorce still weighed heavily on my chest, but it no longer felt like a fatal blow. It was a step toward freedom, a promise that I wouldn't stay broken forever. Even in my loneliness, I recognized that life had seasons, some blossoming, some dying, all giving way eventually to something new. And as I played, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I wasn't defined by what Amanda had done, but by how I rose after the fall. Maybe I'd travel. Maybe I'd pick up more new hobbies. Maybe, just maybe, I'd open my heart again someday. The possibilities felt infinite and terrifying, but also exhilarating in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. That was the moment it hit me. The betrayal that had torn my marriage apart wasn't just an ending. It was also an opportunity, painful as it was, to start over. And I resolved, quietly, firmly, that I would make the most of this second chance at life, no matter how unsteady my first steps might be. Strumming the final chords of my impromptu tune, I glanced around my reclaimed space and let out a soft sigh. The road ahead looked challenging, but I no longer felt crushed under the weight of it. A new kind of determination took root in my chest, fueled by hope and a stubborn will to prove that I could rebuild. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. I laid the guitar aside, stood up, and gazed out the window into the night. The stars looked the same as they always had, but somehow, in the quiet of that moment, they felt like a promise of better days to come.